Well, I'm here today with Christopher. Your last name, Mastropietro. Is that correct?
I wish. Mastropietro.
Mastropietro. Is
Yeah,
that Italian?
it is Italian, very
Okay.
much so.
Okay. And
Yeah, but I get all variations on it, so
do
I'm
you
used
come
to
from a
hearing people
very
get it.
Italian family?
Well, it depends what you mean by very Italian. I mean, my folks were both born here, so my
Okay.
grandparents were the immigrants from Italy.
Okay.
So I think we're fairly Canadianized at this point. I didn't
Okay.
grow up it wasn't fraught with Italianness. But yeah, I certainly have some connection to it that's meaningful to me. But yeah, it's not the first thing I think of.
Did you grow
When
up in Toronto?
I did.
Okay.
I did. Yeah. My family grew up in Montreal, actually, which isn't too far from Toronto. And
Okay.
then they came here in the 80s. So I grew up here. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Now obviously your claim to fame, at least at this point, is you sort of pop on the radar screen with John Vervaeke. How did you get to know him?
Well, I was a student. I mean, my story with John kind of typifies John's relationship with many of his former students and, turned friends and collaborators. I started as a student. This would have been back in, I think it was 2010 when I first took his course and I first met him. Unlike so many that came before me, I was awed by the course, and I was awed by the way it recast so much of what I had already known and studied ostensibly into a very new light, and elucidated things that I had never been exposed to before. And I can just say that in brief, because again, that's the story of so many people who have encountered John. I wasn't the first, certainly not the last. So that happened back in 2010. And then I went away for a while on exchange when I was an undergraduate, and I came back, and all the while, John's course had been gestating, and I had been thinking about it. And it was so meaningful to me, the relation that I had struck with it. Not so much with John as a person, because at that point I didn't know him except as an instructor, but the relation I struck with the course and its content was, I was deeply impressed by it. And so when I got back, I went and approached John, and I prostrated myself before him, and I said, John, I'd like to be involved. It moved me, and I don't know what that means in practice. All I know is that any way I can be of service to it, I would very much like to. So what I really, really wanted to do was to apprentice him in that sort of old academy way that doesn't really happen much anymore at universities, or at least not as much as perhaps it used to. And John, this is obvious certainly to you and to probably any people who watch your videos and John's videos will probably know this already, but John's very intellectually generous, right? His MO is to share his work because he sees it as a concerted effort, as a concerted project, right? His philia, etc. Yeah. So I didn't know that at the time because I didn't know him well as a person. But of course he was very welcoming. He was welcoming of assistance. I think it took some months between the time that I approached him and the time that I actually became a proper collaborator. Because I think he wanted to ease me in. He wanted to test both the degree of my interest and my comprehension of his argument and my capacity to contribute to it. And so we went through a period where, I would help to annotate and provide sort of editorial support to his work. And then eventually that turned a corner, and he offered me co-authorship on the book that at the time he had just started, or I think he had written a preface to it. It was going to be his book on the meaning crisis, right? His definitive work on the topic. And that would have been probably 2012 or so when we started that. And 7 odd years later, here I am. We've been working together more or less continuously, with some breaks now and again, but we've been working more or less continuously since then. Obviously, the project, the figuration of the project has changed profoundly in the intervening years. It looks very different now, both in content and in style, than it did then. So it's transformed a lot. And of course, my relationship with John has as well. We've become very dear friends. So, but yeah, that's the story in brief, perhaps not so brief.
Are you employed by the university?
No, my occupational life is actually not at all really coterminous with my vocational work as it relates to my my work with John. I work in public policy by day, as it were. I moonlight as a co-author with John.
Okay.
I work for the civil service here in Ontario, and I do work related to privacy, etc. So very, very, very separate compartments of life.
Okay.
A lot
Okay.
of cognitive dissonance.
Okay. Well, but that little tidbit of information is really helpful because if you're, I mean, part of the challenge of learning through YouTube is that there's very little context. And so people just pop up on a screen. And so this is part of the reason why I, especially if I'd like to have people share their story, because I think the context of your life is very helpful in terms of understanding your contribution. And that's, I just think, a fact of life. Now, why do you think you found his course so meaningful, and why did it impact you in the way it did, do you think?
Oh, that's a big question. Well, I think it managed to, if I can use a metaphor, John's course was kind of like, it was a way of irrigating seeds that had been sown years prior, but that had never had the opportunity to grow properly. It was like I had latent, well, they weren't latent, but they were certainly underdeveloped interests in both philosophy, particularly that of the ancient Greeks, particularly that of Plato. And then alongside that, I had a prevailing interest in religion and Christianity. And I had I should say in the present tense, a very ambivalent relationship with, I grew up Catholic, but I have a very ambivalent relationship with my Catholicism. I shouldn't say my Catholicism, because the question of religious identity is a very tricky question. Maybe we can get into that later. But I grew up a Catholic, and I had a very ambivalent relationship with it. Yeah.
Well, that's what I do.
That's what you do. Well, I'm looking forward to chatting about that with you, because even having seen a couple of your videos already, I enjoy the way that you interrogate this matter of religious identity. And I'm actually kind of looking forward to doing it with you.
Okay.
Because I have a couple questions for you. I'm genuinely curious to get your take on a couple of things.
Okay. Well, let's focus on you for the first little while.
I had this. Sure. Yeah. So I had this. Despite my ambivalence, practically, I had a persistent academic interest in religion and then burgeoning in theology and in philosophy, and all of these things were really entangled. And I had been pursuing that interest in my degree up to that point, but I had found, with few exceptions, that the quality, I had found that the depth and the tenor of the instruction was not speaking to me. There was something wasn't connecting, and it was almost like I don't know. It's funny when I think of my university education up to the point I met John. There was sort of a listlessness to it. It was interested and it had its moments, but there was something less than ultimate about it, if I can put it that way. And it wasn't really getting to where the heat of my interest really lay. And the course with John changed all of that, because it was as though I had been trying to access the meaning of this central project that lay in succession through the spine of all of these different epochs and disciplines, right? Being, for instance, Platonism and Neoplatonism, right? And the succession through into Christianity and Christian thought, etc. That there's a central project that burns at the heart of those traditions, a symbolic project, what I now know, or what I now conceive to be a symbolic project, that I find deeply meaningful and stirring and moving, but that the academic conveyance of those traditions and those topics at the university was not accessing that somehow. And John did. And John knows that about himself. In fact, I think he and you spoke about that to some degree in your last chat together. He knows this about himself because enough people like me have told him that he has a way of representing that project in such a way that he depicts its essence accurately and with all due importance. Because that was the other thing. It was like, I mean, he'll probably enjoy me saying this because I'm going to use the word relevance. And of course, his relevance realization is very, very fundamental to his work.
Yes.
And virtual students of his who are following his videos will know that. But he also had a way of testifying to the relevance of that content, the relevance of philosophia, the relevance of the Christian project as well, despite not being a Christian, which is a wonderful irony about John that I never cease to enjoy, that it took a non-Christian to convey, you know, the essence of the project of Christianity to me, even though I grew up ostensibly as a Christian. But he had a way of expressing and exemplifying, you know, both in his deportment and his passion for the actual content, but also, of course, in the lucidity of his lectures. He had a way of conveying its relevance, its import, why I should care, you know, in a way that few other people did. And because for him, it's a practice, right? It's something to be assumed and embodied and enacted. It's not simply a series of interesting or uninteresting propositional facts, right? So anyway, that's what it was at first. Mm-hmm. And then it all unfolded from there.
Okay. What was the practice of your family growing up with respect to the Catholicism that you experienced in your home growing up?
Well, I think we were Catholics nominally. Maybe we typified Catholics, at least Catholics, you know, Canadian Catholics of a certain profile, because you know, we didn't go to church very often. So we had, I would say, a cultural relationship to Catholicism, perhaps, as opposed to a deeply religious relationship to Catholicism. That was at least true of me. My parents both differed, I think, in their relationship to Catholicism. But the kind that I inherited was a cultural, a habitual one, a respectful one. It wasn't like I didn't abjure. I mean, I didn't abjure my Catholicism and disavow it and rebel against it. And I had a few moments in adolescence, but I was never harmed by it, certainly. But I also wasn't whelmed by it when I was young. And we went to church, you know, pretty infrequently. But despite, I never, as time went on, you know, certainly in early adulthood, I stopped identifying myself as a Catholic or as a Christian, because I felt that it was, and I don't mean that gleefully at all. You know, if anything, as I've gotten older and older, I've developed a deeper connection and relationship, and respect sounds too dissociated. So respect's not the right word, but involvement with it. So I don't mean that I eschewed it gleefully or anything like that, but I never felt like I could authentically call myself a Catholic or a Christian, because I was not a practitioner. You know, I didn't frequent service. I didn't partake of sacraments. I didn't, you know, I didn't pray. Certainly not in any, you know, not in any way, discernible way. Not in an ecclesial way, I should say. So I disidentified with it because I didn't feel that I could wear it and be genuine. And I still feel that way, despite my deep intellectual appreciation of it, and despite the work that I'm doing with John, in which it figures very importantly, I still feel somewhat dissociated from it. But on the other hand, it's funny that, you know, I say that, but I think in some ways it's also kind of an endogenous feature of me. Like, you know, you can take the person out of the Catholicism, but you can't take the Catholicism out of the person. I do feel I do feel that that's true.
Yeah.
And I can feel its I can feel it working through me at times, you know, especially as I've gotten older. I see it surfacing in my behavior. More and more. Yeah. So I know it's there. It's like baked into my tissue. That's sort of what I was alluding to at the beginning when I said the issue of religious identity is such a fraught one for me, because I identified by practice and identified by any formal affiliations or, you know, involvement in the liturgy, etc. I am clearly not a Catholic or a Christian, right? I don't practice. I don't partake of the rituals.
What did you study when you went to university?
A myriad of things. I veered into all kinds of things. I settled on doing semiotics, which was the study of signs and symbols, but in and around that was a mixture of philosophy, of a little bit of political science, and then a miscellaneous kind of panoply of different things that I could, whatever I could grab and tuck under the semiotics umbrella, because administratively it was very permissive to be able to take courses from various disciplines and then fold them into a semiotics major, which was convenient in some ways at the time, although I think it's bitten me since then, because you end up being an enthusiast of many disciplines and a master of none of them. So I think that became my lot a little bit, but semiotics nominally was my major, and that was a way of framing my interest in these other topics, these other disciplines.
What do you think's at the heart of John's project? One of the things that I've learned in talking to students of you know, some students of Jordan Peterson is that I've discovered that some of his students, sometimes the student knows the master better than the master knows himself, because one of the things, you know, coming from the inside, we've got all of this. We're all bound up in ourselves, and those watching us and listening to us, they sometimes know us better in certain degrees than we know ourselves. So if you could summarize John's project, what do you think it is?
That's a really interesting point. I think that's true. And I think that I'll answer your question in a second, but I just wanted to jump on this thought, because I think that your point, which I think is well put, speaks to the importance of cultivating intimate relationships that are very comprehending, such that you can trust people to tell you things about yourself that you might not have known. And I think that's very true, Paul. Yeah. I think so reductively, John's project, both his intellectual project and I think fundamentally his personal project, because for him they're continuous, as are the relationships, right? There's a reason that many of John's close colleagues are also close friends and vice versa, right? Because again, he believes deeply in this platonic sociability and platonic intimacy, whereby discourse becomes a way of interpenetrating perspective and interjecting, you know, other selves to in order that all involved may identify with the process of knowing, right? That you become continuous with that process of revealing and unfolding things, and that the best way of doing that is in a concerted process. And that's what the dialogos, right, the Socratic dialogos is about. And that's why John is such an ardent apologist and advocate for the Socratic dialogos, because it's not community for the sake of community, which I think is important to say, but it's community leveraged for a kind of, I'm always tempted to use an instrumental metaphor, because I think the tuning, using extrinsic melodies to tune and then to tune in concert in order to actually synchronize and harmonize, which is a very ancient metaphor, obviously, but I think that's really apt when talking about John and when talking about John's, his sort of the telos, if there can be said to be one, of his project. Certainly, that's what I think he would aspire to. I think John's, I mean, I don't want to talk about it too personally, but I think this much will be obvious.
He'll watch this.
He'll watch this, yeah. But I'm not. I certainly won't say anything that he hasn't already said in one form or another himself in these various conversations he's had publicly. That, you know, John is I think were he not so harmed by it early in life, John has what can be said to me to actually be a very, very deeply, deeply religious instinct and attunement. And I think that saying that is completely commensurate with his definition of non-theism, as he self-reports it. I think that's true. I think those things can be simultaneously true. But that's why John has this appreciable comprehension of religion and the religious project and the religious experience, as few people that I've met do. And there's obviously a reason for that. And so I think that in his heart, he feels it very. He's like, it's almost like he's afflicted by it. He has a very almost he's possessed of a certain, I don't know, a certain perspicacity when it comes to religious thinking, and his relationship with it is very ambivalent too. But I think he feels, and I can say this also because perhaps just by proxy to him and in my own right, I feel some version of the same thing. He feels burdened by his comprehension that there is a problem of such a high order that it appears insoluble, and that the only way of addressing it is to take very, very, very close examination of it and to vivisect it properly. And I think he sees it. And I think he feels it. And I think that his awareness of that problem, I kind of think about it as, imagine, and again, I know that you're a Christian pastor, so I'm aware that I'm talking to a Christian as I say this, but again, just as he would say, I mean it very respectfully. I have this sense
you won't hurt me.
I know I won't.
Speak the truth. I value frank communication
I
more
have
than adorned and embroidered communication.
Yes. Well, that's one of your virtues as an interlocutor. That's been clear to me just watching a couple of your videos, which is why I'm so pleased to be talking to you, Paul. Because, by the way, this is me breaking the seal. I mean, this is the first time I've done a video such as this.
Oh, really?
And yeah, it is. I'm extremely, this is a whole other topic of conversation, but when it comes to like online, like extemporizing about these kinds of topics online, especially about topics of such, like, these are dizzying stakes to me, we're talking about things of an ultimate value, and so talking offhandedly about them in a public forum in a very unpolished way is a scary thing. I'm always afraid of like being in excess of my expertise, which is bound to happen a lot, and I'm very, very wary of that. It makes me nervous, but it's also, perhaps for the same reasons, it's so important that I need to start loosening the knot on that kind of taciturn instinct a little bit. As you can see, and clearly my issue with it isn't that overwhelming, because here I am talking to you and enjoying it.
Well, you're very articulate and you speak well. So,
but it's actually it's pardon?
Oh, we are getting some feedback. We are getting some delay.
Are we?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that an audio thing that I should resolve with some headphones, or?
Yeah, if you plug in some headphones, it'll probably help. It's part of the delay in the communication.
Okay. All right. Give me a second. I'll do that. Okay, Paul. How's this?
Sounds good.
Oh, wait.
It's still coming out your speakers. If you move your mouse, I'll just pause the recording. Oops.
Okay.
So yeah, I was saying,
right.
You're very articulate. You're really well spoken, and in the two kind of ancillary videos that you did with John, I was very impressed with, I could see you starting to run with some things in the zombie video and in the symptomatic video. And so I wanted to, I wanted to pick your brain a little bit. And again, as I found with Jordan Peterson, it's talking to some of Jordan's students, and I mean probably some of Jordan's exceptional students that have worked with him, not just been in his class, but been partners with him. You can get a better sense of, okay, what's his project? What is he really doing? Because, like your reticence, anybody with any sense at all would say, yeah, to just go on YouTube and start spewing ideas, especially if you have things to lose, it's not necessarily the most, there's risk involved in this. So, and I appreciate that, but I'm a little older.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm at the point in my career where it's like, all right, I can do this. And my sons who are in their 20s.
Well, you do it well. You've cultivated it very well.
Well, that's just age. You learn how to do stuff as you get old if you're blessed with it. So, part of what's in, a lot of people who listen to me I don't think necessarily understand my project. I am fascinated by people's religious behaviors, especially those that have happened, I think, in some ways because of the failure of the church. And one might argue that, in fact, the entire Protestant Reformation is part of that. Almost every Protestant in some way could say, I'm a Protestant because the Latin Church failed me. And even the division between the Latin and the Eastern Church is a demarcation of failure. But in all of that failure, there's at least the potential for, okay, well, what has the church failed to learn? What has the church failed to grow? And so, your story, so then it's very interesting to me and very believable to me how, okay, grew up nominally Catholic, went to university, and here this professor who himself has, had an experience with the church, a different church that set him on a course in some ways parallel to it. That really interests me. And so that's part of the reason why I'm, very interested in talking to you and really discovering what you've learned. Because I think we are, we are seeking, in a sense, Paul in Athens in the book of Acts, we're seeking something that we don't know, or we don't know it enough. Now, again, I have a whole bunch of people who are going to jump on me for saying something. Well, you're a pastor, certainly you know God. Yeah, but to know God more. And basically by the definition of God and Christianity, he, by virtue of our size and his size, he is not something we can ever exhaust. And what I originally,
that's right.
I originally was interested in, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. It's like, why would this guy, there's kind of the whole political side of it, which is certainly part of the rise. But to me, the more fascinating element was why are so many people at least religion curious because of him? And then when people started then pointing me to John's work,
right.
And whereas Jordan's kind of doing his thing, I noticed with John a much more careful walking through of an argument, paying careful attention to the philosophy, and then learning. I didn't know much about cognitive science, but it's learning that. And so I thought, well, this is a project that interests me because I'm going to be able, and I found myself learning, reflecting on experience as a pastor and saying, oh, here are some psychological reasons for the things that I see in people. And so that's part of what sort of drew me into this corner of the conversation. Now,
Paul, if I can just before you go on, if I
yeah,
can say, I think that especially as a pastor, at this point in your career, at this point in your vocation, turning to such a voluminous and weighty conversation and diving headlong into it in the careful way that you've done, I think is an extremely existentially courageous thing to have done. And I mean that, like, I mean that very sincerely, because a person can hold fast to his set of propositions, and you know, and 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 loathe the idea of being dispossessed of them, because to be dispossessed of them is a very destabilizing thing, right? That aphoretic experience of suddenly facing a disclosure that undermines the scaffolding of your belief systems, is an incredibly dangerous thing, and I mean that. It's a dangerous thing to do. It's important, but it's dangerous, and I think it takes a certain amount of courage to do it. So I just wanted to say that I'm very impressed by that, and I applaud you for it, really.
well, thank you. Well, so you went to university, you studied semiotics, you
Yep.
got into John's class, you in a sense, presented yourself as an apprentice, and again I've been very struck by his generosity, his openness, his willingness to engage.
Yeah.
That's been quite remarkable to me.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
now, how has first, are you married?
No.
Okay, so
I'm not.
because
Single,
that's a dimension, if you're married, spiritual journeys with a partner are different than, because they're so foundational and they're so deep, and many things, that very much changes people. So what
I can imagine.
what changed you about how did John's course change you? And not only in terms of thought, but also in terms of emotion and practice.
That's a good question. How did it? Well, I think the course. I mean, the value of the course. The course just impressed me. It sort of it. I was shell shocked with wonder by the course, because it just took so much of what I had been interested in, and put a light underneath it. And so the value of the course really, but in the end, the value of the course was the entree to John and to his work. It was my way into his world. So the value of the course is just, at this point, is just instrumental. It just got me to him. And it was also an accident, right? I was very unfamiliar with him beforehand, and I took the course because it kind of sounded interesting, and in a very Socratic way, he framed its thesis very unassumingly. So it was a great deal more than I bargained for. So the course just got me to him. The practice of working with him, though, and getting to know him well, and collapsing together the professional and the personal dimensions of the relationship, has availed all kinds of things for me. I mean, it has shown me, well, for one thing, it's shown me what it's revealed my own skill set, I think, to me more clearly than I think I knew it before. I was very, for a long time, I was very insecure about what exactly what things I had an affinity for and which things I didn't, and identifying too closely with those things, but identifying with them, again, sort of in the wrong way. So I think working with John, it gave me practice, especially the practice of working on the book with John. I was just writing all the time with him, I was writing in volume that I had never written in before. And then the process of actually fashioning the material with him, right? Working with him on the editorial process, working with him on the arguments. And we spent so many hours and hours and hours and hours over the last several years that the practice of doing that, I mean, it made me a better writer for one thing, but it made me a more perspicuous thinker and communicator. Because, I mean, I'm not trying to aggrandize John by saying this. I mean, John's a dear friend, so I have no, I don't worry about, there's no risk of me inveigling him or anything like that. When I pay him a compliment, it's true that John has had the kind of effect on me and my thinking and my constitution, my intellectual and in some ways my emotional constitution, that the figure of Socrates is supposed to have on the constitution of his interlocutors. You're supposed to internalize the process. You're supposed to internalize the figure and the figure's way of operating, and you're supposed to assume it. And it helps you to elasticize the way in which you identify and adopt and change perspectives. And reflexively, that also means that it changes the way you identify with yourself. You identify yourself as kind of for the no. It's a good one, eh? I wish I could claim it.
Technology is the god that limps. I'm gonna add that to the notes. I'm a bad note taker.
Yeah.
I get interested and I stop taking notes when I get interested.
Oh, really? See, it's funny. I'm the opposite. I can scarcely get through a video or get through a book sometimes because I'm so busy with my marginalia that I have to stop and just follow the stream of consciousness. Anyway, I'm not sure where I cut out, but I guess what I was, again, I'll be briefer, but what I was trying to say about my rapport with John is what it did is his method, his dialogic method, which is very Socratic in nature because he has, I think, both by disposition and by practice, cultivated a very Socratic discursive method. I've internalized it and over the years and identified by means of it. And so I have a very close sense of identification with John, and that's why we have an easy shorthand, is because we have a shared vocabulary, both literally and otherwise, that allows for a very, it just allows for a very interpenetrated way of thinking and communicating. So where was I going with that? So just understanding my own interests, orienting better to my own interests, and also distinguishing them from John. I mean, for a long time, all I did was essentially put myself in service of his work. And then what happened over time is there was a process of individuating from it and participating in the work as a full participant, as opposed to simply an instrument in service of his melody. Yep. And so now we contribute. Now I co-author properly with him because I understand my own. I understand how my skill set and also the different kind of. I mean, I'll never have John's kind of his particular. I'll never have John's erudition and his sort of his lexical knowledge, but what I can often bring to him is a certain way of rendering his argument. Sort of like he brings the architecture for the building, and then I help him to furnish it. That's kind of how it works, if I can use that metaphor. So I think I help him to render his arguments in such a way that I can help pronounce things that need pronouncing, and bring a certain poetic sensibility to what is otherwise a very rigorously analytic. I don't mean analytic in the proper philosophical sense of analytic. I just mean sort of has a certain analytical rigor, and I think I bring a certain I think you would say this. I bring a certain poetic sensibility to that, and we found that the two are very complementary. So I think that in terms of the work itself, I have attuned by his influence and by proxy to him. I've attuned much more to what facets of the argument and what features of the work move me and speak to me, which ones I identify with, because there's a lot that John does that I don't, I mean, I'm not a cognitive scientist, nor have I ever aspired to be. The cognitive science work, I mean, I understand it well enough insofar as I need to, in order for us to co-author these works that include those arguments. But I don't identify as closely with that dimension of his work, right? I identify more closely with the continental philosophical and theological dimensions of the work. And so understanding which parts of those I indwell and which parts I don't as much allows me to cultivate those more closely and understand my contributions to them properly. But I think personally, I've become much John's very, I mean, and you know this because you've conversed with John, and it's true. I mean, the John you get in the videos is John. He's very genuine, extremely.
Yes.
Very open and very forthcoming.
Yeah.
I was not used to that kind of openness, just that kind of forthright honesty. I mean, I love discussing, I love talking, as you can probably tell, but I also have parts of me are very taciturn as well. And John, because John is so provocative. I don't mean that in a scandalous way. I just
no, I understand.
He inquires, right? And because he does that, he has, you can't not be honest with John, because his nature just not demands in the sense of being prescriptive, but he just begs honesty,
Yeah.
So I think that my friendship with John helped me to be, I think, a lot more forthcoming, and that to great results.
What do you think was your existential experience with the meaning crisis? I think John's framing of the meaning crisis has been one of the really helpful things I've taken from his work, and your conversation with him about the symptoms of the meaning crisis. I think that's probably one of my favorite videos in the whole series, because I thought, as a pastor, you see a lot of things and you look for patterns, and then this meaning crisis sort of saying, "Oh, look at this." And
I have to say, your sort of secondary exegesis on our video, I did watch it and I was very impressed by it. I thought that you were very incisive with your the way you annotated it, by the way.
Well, thank you. So how did, I mean, because I would imagine, I mean, a truth about us that at some point, if we mature, we should learn, is that we are certainly not transparent to ourselves, and that the aches in our hearts and the hungers that we seek to satisfy are driven by things around and within that demand satisfaction. And I think the framing of that within the meaning crisis is a very helpful way of connecting us with thousands of years of civilization and its fruits and its poverties. So how has that played for you? I mean, where did you see that in your own life? Do you think that's part of what drew you to this?
I actually think that the presence of the meaning crisis has grown. I think that the presence of the meaning crisis has actually interiorly grown within me more and more over the last several years since I started to work with John on it.
Interesting.
Which, and I don't mean that it's some kind of, confirmation bias or anything like that. I just mean that I think the work has made me aware of it, where perhaps it was formerly a little bit more dormant or appeared in the guise of other things, other anxieties, other insecurities. And now it's actually quite a relief, just as it always is when you have a firm or at least an approximate diagnosis of something that has been tormenting you, to be able to look it full in the face in a Nietzschean way and say, there it lies. I see it. I see it. I kind of feel, and I think John, when I was talking before about what it is that drives John, or what John's experience of the meaning crisis is, it occurred to me one day that I see the meaning crisis as, by analogy, because that's all I've got, imagine that we're living in the afterglow of a dying star. To me, that's what the Christian world is to me. Now I mean this in ways that we don't have time to unpack today, but that's where God lies for me, is that that by definition it's somehow continuous with the nature of the self, and that there's some infinite aspect of the self, the kind of infinite aspect that someone like Kierkegaard described, that has been lost to us, that we've been that's now what was formerly continuous is now discontinuous, and that the loss of that infinite aspect, the loss of the partaking in eternity, for instance, the partaking of eternity of the self that Christ symbolizes, is lost to us. Now, irrevocably, I don't know, right? I'm just describing a feeling. And the dying star analogy is the closest I've come to depicting both the existential despair of the problem and also the magnitude of the problem, right? Because there's nothing obvious to replace the archetypal image of Christ, right? To the West. And I'm speaking within certain boundaries. I want to be clear about that. But there's no obvious substitution for that. It's like every substitution that we grasp at, all it is just a pale. It's the same symbol, but just in different guises. Every pseudo sacred or pseudo religious substitution, and this is part of what John and I were talking about in our video, right? Every one that we can find is just that symbol, that archetypal image of behind, in a different set of vestments. And we see that, right, with the various mythic fads and cultures, and calling them fads, I don't mean that they don't have value and import, and the play and the sense of participation that they induce does have value, and insofar as it refers us to the sacral importance of our fundamental symbols, I think that's valuable, because I think it reorients us and points us indexically in the direction that we actually ought to be looking. So insofar as they do that, I think those mythoi, if I can call them that, are valuable. But they're wizened, like they're feeble, and they can't solve anything, because all they are approximations of something that is slowly and gradually receding from us. And that's why that dying star example, it speaks to me so much, because it's such a slow and gradual declension. It's such a slow process, right? And it also taps into that definition of despair as a kind of interminable death or dying, right? The sense of hyperventilation is that you breathe in less air every time, but you're still getting enough to survive. Something is falling away, and so that experience, that sort of notional awareness, is something that has come upon me with more potency, I think, even in the last few years than it did in the 10 years prior, because I also when you're an adolescent, I'm speaking generally. When I was an adolescent, I should just speak for myself. I was working on just figuring out who the hell I was and what I could do and what I couldn't and what I loved and what I didn't. So there wasn't as much time for ruminating on things that require you to have a certain integrality in order to even sense them, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I think once I had some of that, then the inkling of the magnitude of that problem started to disclose itself a little bit more to me. And obviously the work that I'm doing with John has facilitated that as well and given it shape and geometry and vocabulary and all that jazz. Sorry, I don't know if that answered your question, Paul. I kind of went. I went off on a tangent there, as I want to do.
No, it's good. That was, and I think when you said, John brings the architecture and you help furnish it. I think that's very true about when I watch at least the little glimpses we've had of you two working together, because one of the things that I noted, part of the difficulty in following John is that you have to really keep up with his definitions and understand what he's trying to say. And it's really helpful to have someone who can in fact furnish this a bit and give some, provide some word pictures and some metaphors that a broader audience can understand. And I think, just in that bit of a discourse, you did that well.
I'm glad.
No, and thank you. Quite hauntingly, I think part of what's been interesting about let's say, and I love how John has been so open and upfront with this, because of course myself and Jonathan Pajot are sort of the Christians on the block, and every time, I mean, John, and I completely understand why he says it this way, and given how he talks about Christianity no longer being a viable solution, I fully appreciate. I mean, given the last 150, 200 years of Western civilization, that's by no means an assertion to make without supporting evidence. And given what I've seen from within the church happening to churches in the last, what is so difficult about all of these conversations is that whenever we use us or we, there's always an implicit framing, and the world is just simply too diverse. Way too heterogeneous. Yeah, that's right. Because there have been within the last, I mean, when I regularly mention to people that within the United States, church attendance reached its historic peak, and during the Cold War, that surprises people, because people have sort of this subtraction. That's the subtraction story from Charles Taylor, that there's just kind of the steady decline of Christianity and church attendance and that practice over time. That's not true at all. So if church attendance was too simplistic, that's right. So so you had the Great Awakenings in the colonial period, when things kind of got superheated and then they cooled down. They did second Great Awakening, but even in all of these movements, there are always it is just simply so complex. The way ideas come in, the way practices come in, the way it intersects with economics and politics and wars and cultures and all the different cultures, especially in the Americas, that all get twisted in together. Hazarding commentary on any of this at all, it is fraught with just about everything. So it's difficult to talk about trend lines, but and I obviously, if I thought that Christianity was no longer a viable project, well, then I should probably, in all integrity, get a new job. But I obviously don't think that. But I very much respect John's position, and I actually find I look for conversation partners that are different from me. I can talk to Christian Reformed pastors all day long. And I do talk to them. Yeah, absolutely. I'm always heading out there because and now with looking for interesting conversation partners. Now with YouTube, it's like, oh my goodness, there's a whole world full of them. So I'm sincerely blessed. But I really love how you framed it, because I really love how you framed it, because I think that's a very apt, poetic description of. So obviously from my channel, one of the things I enjoy is doing exactly what we're doing now. I want to hear your story. I want to hear your experience, because you grew up in a different place than I did. You had different parents, but there are many others like you, and I'm interested in them too. And I think I think this is exactly the job of what a Christian minister should be doing, because if we're not listening and understanding people's experience and people's stories, then we can't be good pastors. So I appreciate this. Now here's a question that I'm probably going to ask John at some point, but again, it's kind of fun to ask a student, especially one like you who does have a real gift for. I think you really complement. I can see how you two are collaborators, because I can very much see how your giftedness complements each other. How you take a lot of sort of his wonky care and add some color and some poetry and some beauty to it. And because that is so important, because otherwise, John's work, a lot of people are going to listen to him and just simply get lost in the magnitude and complexity. It's like, okay, 25 videos, and people are like, well,
sometimes myself still.
Oh, absolutely. We can only hold so much in these little heads. Here's a question for you. I've been so impressed with John's relevance realization, even just the choice of realization as a word, because realization is one of these words that's on a swivel.
Okay.
Because sometimes realization means concrete realization. This trackball is the physical material realization of an engineer's dream, and of an inventor's dream, and of a factory engineer's dream, and of a marketer's dream. And so there is a ton that's just packed into this tiny little thing that we think hardly anything of. That is realization. But realization, I think, is also in the Barfieldian sense. It's such a perfect Barfieldian term because it straddles the inside outside of something. Because realization is also this moment of insight and this mental vision. And so relevance realization, the more I walk around with that term, and when you get a term like this, you kind of walk around with it and you see different things. It's like, ooh, and you begin seeing it all over the place and saying, ooh, that is a really powerful thing. And I was really struck by how he used it in the Darwinian biological context. Just that thought there, I'm by no means done chewing on that mentally. Just that thought there is really formative. So I've been, part of what I began to notice through the conversations between Jordan Peterson and atheists is, I think, the historic divorce within the God concept that I call God number one and God number two.
Yes, and I thought that was interesting.
And so here's my question for you. Is John's relevance realization God?
Oh. Is John's relevance realization God?
I mean,
no,
it's sort of,
I don't think it is.
But in his system.
No. I know what you mean. I know what you mean. No, I don't think. That's a good question. I don't think the relevance realization. So if we were to take the expression of God, if we were to take that moniker and give it a definition that would place it comfortably within John's typology and his relevance realization framework. I can't believe I'm about to try and give a definition of John's God. My goodness, he's going to kill me. I would say it would be some. Okay, so I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it by proxy to that typology, and hopefully maybe we can fold it back in.
Okay.
I think that, and this is, again, it's like a poetic approximation, but I think what we might call God in a Vervaekean sense is like an expression given to the motioning of aletheia, right? The efflorescing disclosure of being when it yields to a becoming. So imagine like God is sort of the oceanic that's fed by a current of knowing that passes through the open self. When that self has become a vessel for knowing, it's the disclosure of the realization, the cascading disclosure of the realization, and its inexhaustibility. John uses that word a lot. There's a reason for it, right? And I would call it a symbolic cascading, but that's a different conversation. The symbolic cascading of realization of something like what Heidegger called unconcealment, right? The revelation of the ontological revelation of reality that is precipitated by an optimization of relevance realization, right? A sacred optimization of relevance realization, right? It's exactation and sacredness, right? The opponent processing and the resultant complexification, that cascading disclosure, and the flow of that cascading disclosure, and the sense of non-duality, the oneness, right? Again, hearkening to the Neoplatonic one as a way of approximating the idea that disclosure is more like what I might call God in a Vervaekean sense.
Yeah, I could see that.
Did that make any sense?
Oh yeah. Well, it only makes sense if you sat through 34 hours, actually way more than 34 hours, because I often have to listen to his videos more than once to capture.
Sorry, Paul. You just cut out. You just cut out for me for the last 20 odd seconds. Would you mind just going back? Sure. After I stopped talking, I didn't hear anything from you.
Okay.
Which I thought was funny. Yeah, well, but
I think that made a lot of sense. And, part of why I like recording these things is because the beauty of videotape is you could go back and listen, which is exactly what I've done with John's series, because I can't just capture most of his lectures. I can't just capture the first time. Upon second and third and fourth hearing, it begins to sink in. But no, I think that is I would, I'd have to, I couldn't spit it back to you the way you spit it to me, but yeah. I think, you see,
it's the processual, like God is not the framework. God has something more to the expression of God, refers more to the processual unveiling, the processual contact, the intensifying connectivity and connectedness to the world that is enabled by a cultivation of the relevance realization, right? Like it's not the machinery itself. I hate to use such a mechanical term, but of course he uses it. It's not the machinery, right? It's the connectedness that it affords that is closer to what is expressed by God, I think.
Well, and I think that's right. And that's fairly God number 2-ish. And where I see the split, what happened, I think, in the history of the West, and I think Charles Taylor was very helpful for me in this. And I really have to read more Taylor, but he's so daggone long.
Taylor's been very helpful. Yeah.
But this split in God in the West, where, especially through deism, where what happens in part of what's difficult about Christianity is that it is not pantheism, and so then people try to go to panentheism to add, let's say, another layer. There's in many ways, when the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, who quotes, a pagan poet, says, in him, and Paul sort of encodes it in the Bible for Christians to not be able to ignore. In him we live and move and have our being. That there's the God number oneness in that God is the ground of all being, but yet there is a separation between God and his creation that affords this. One of the other things I like about John's approach is that he does very much see it's not all bottom up and it's not all top down, but there's movement both ways. And I think there's something deeply right. I think there's something deeply biblical about that in terms of what I would say in a classical theistic sense about God's project in the creation. God pours himself. I mean, the world is in a sense God's overflow of his glory manifest, but he does so in a way that he actually comes into real relationship with it. And you cannot have relationship without the other. But and so some of the commenters on my channels keep talking about, non-duality. It's like, all right, what are you going to say after that? Because there's always a in order to have a partnership, there must be some duality where it's this is God and this is not God. And the difficulty that I think has happened in the West, as I listen carefully to many who have sort of unhappily fallen out of the church and are trying to figure the world out, sometimes with a bit of a bias against what had been given to them, is that there is a sense in which we are not anywhere near as capable of independence from God as we might imagine. And this, of course, sets up the entire difficult conversation of what hell is, because hell is, in a sense, the complete alienation from God. And C.S. Lewis puts it so nicely, where he says,
"God problem of pain." Right.
That's right. Have you read that book?
I did read that book years ago, but it did leave an impression on me. And I know you're a fan of C.S. Lewis, and that I remember that enjoying that book a lot. Yes. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you.
No, that's fine. So I like your. It'll be interesting to hear what John has to say about your definition of his God. It's
not complete. Like, it's not. I mean, here's the thing, though, and here's why it's a trick question. And you asked it. I'm not sure if you asked it knowing it was a trick question.
Oh, of course. They're the most fun questions.
Like, positing a definition for God is probably not something that John would be inclined to do. I would be much more inclined to do it than John, and so I have to take care to parse mine from his, because they're contiguous but independent. Because I actually, you were talking in your last chat with John, you invoked, I think, as God one, you invoked, I think it was a quote from Peterson about, God being the person of all persons, right? I thought that was a really cool quote, because to me, it reminded me of a similar quote that I read by Jack Lindsay, which says, "The self is a symbol for life." And I love that, because I find it, for a long time now, I've found it very helpful. And this is part of the work I'm doing with John. And it's also part of work I'm doing with another close friend of mine named Patrick Kelly. We're trying to flesh this argument out a little bit more. But for me, I find it helpful to conceive of the self, again, by analogy, but to me, by a very instrumental analogy, as a symbol consisting of symbols, as a symbol for symbolizing, right? Which is to say, a symbol, like you talk about the self's relationship to the other and knowing God by means of the other. That resonates with me quite a bit, because I think of the process of symbolizing relations with others, right? which is to say the intercourse, and I mean that as a deliberately erotic, not a sexual one, but a deliberately erotic metaphor, that the intercourse of knowing with others is a way of calibrating our symbolic relation reflexively with ourselves, and of identifying ourselves with something more processual, something relational, because the self is, by some definition, relational. And so I like this idea of the self as a symbol that coheres symbols. And so imagine for a moment that the self is a symbol of symbols. And if that being the case, the referent for that symbol is God. If the self is a symbol, its referent is God. And that's kind of how I think about it. I'm not sure that John would say the same thing, but for me, that's been a helpful way of thinking about it. And it kind of dovetails with Tillich's idea of the God beyond God, the ever-referring symbol, the ever-enacting and transmuting symbol, that the self is a symbol that refers to its likeness in inexhaustibility, right? That it's like the self is like the self casts a shadow upon the canopy, and that shadow is the thing that we've given the expression of God, like a penumbra in the sky or something like that. I don't mean that in an illusory way. I just mean that that's what I mean when I say I think that somehow the definition of God and the definition of the city. About God. There we
No.
are.
I'm really enjoying this. This is very, very good and very, very interesting. This is very good. It's helpful because I think part of what ails this land of the dying sun is we have abandoned the cultivation of our language with respect to God. And I think part of, it was so interesting. So I did a video on the Alistair McGrath, Brett Weinstein conversation. And early in the video, Brett talked about the fact that he grew up in, a nominal Jewish household, and he wanted to go to Hebrew school because he wanted to learn more about this religion. And he learned that Hebrew school was not a place to ask questions. And when he said that, I just grieve at that, because I think, and yeah, okay, so it wasn't a church, and I can't take responsibility for it, but we have to ask questions. We have to talk. And where I think the church has seriously failed is its ability to not only be a space for asking questions, but be a space for engaging seriously with those questions and to not fear them.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
And so one of the things that we just kind of started, a lot of this I've just kind of backed and bumbled into, is we started a meetup locally, and I had no idea of the hunger out there of people, most of which do not go to church regularly, don't identify as Christian, some might identify as atheist, but the hunger that they have for just having serious, meaningful, honest conversation, that it's within a bit of a walled garden. We don't allow it to be polluted by political partisanship, because lately in my adult Sunday school class, I kind of stumbled upon, in a sense, politics is the now, but religion is the always. And because
that's why political concerns, or concerns that are politically framed, are always downstream from religious concerns.
That's exactly right. And so I, for a long time was struggling, how to frame these two things. But, we all have to deal with the now, and we should do so. But we also need some, in a sense, I want the church to be a place where we can talk about the always, and not have the now.
I like that.
Not have the now corrupt the always, because the always needs its own tending. So
the eternal. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
And another ongoing fascination of mine is in fact the question, what is matter for? Because it's very easy for us as Western comfortable human beings to lose ourselves in certain Gnosticisms where everything just sort of floats away. And that, a lot of that is happening in terms of religious conversations culturally right now. You know, things are just kind of floating away. But the atheists...
What do you mean by floating away?
Oh, I think part of, you know, why did Jordan Peterson blow up over, of all things, non-gender pronouns? You know, what's that about? Well, yeah, there's a political matrix, so there's some nowness going on in there, but there's also an alwaysness. So I was a foreign missionary for a number of years. Now we have this Discord server, and we've got people from all around the world. We're talking about these topics. You know, one woman there is a missionary from Africa, and it's so much fun having her in the conversation because, well, Africa's an increasing part of the entire world population-wise and is going to have its own significance. But many of our conversations, well, you know, in our current gender conversation, we don't know what to do about a penis. You know, it's the silliest thing. And and you know, there was an article recently in the Atlantic. It was a very interesting article with someone telling the story of their school, and it was an elementary school, you know, one of the best schools in the city, a school that everybody's on wait lists for. And you know, they had a transitioning student, and the student, you know, felt a little stigmatized because they had to use the one non-gender bathroom. So they degendered all the bathrooms in the school. This is a grade school. They took off all the boys and girls signs. And I mean, the chaos that happened was completely predictable to anyone who knows children. And eventually they had to put the signs back on.
Oh my goodness, I can only imagine.
But before, with all of the adults seemingly abdicating any understanding of the intersection between, in a sense, our mind and our bodies, the children started basically deciding they would all simply go to the old bathrooms they usually used because the attendant chaos and disruption was too much for them. And so the kids started acting out the boys in the girls' bathrooms all by themselves before the school finally put up the signs again. And it's like, okay, well, we can talk about the politics and all of that stuff if you want to, but the real question is, what is the age-old philosophical question? What is the relationship between mind and matter? I mean, because there we are in that question again. And to what degree is my mind male? Is maleness an aspect of my mind? That's not an easy or simple question, but as looking at the way that so much evangelical Christianity has gone extremely Gnostic. When I go to many evangelical churches and I hear things like, well, the purpose of Christianity is that you die and go to heaven. And it's like, wait a minute, you got the crucifixion in there, but did you forget the resurrection? I mean, what's the point of that story? Easter's supposed to be the central fact of the creation of Christianity, and huge swaths of the church that will say, I believe in the Bible, simply forget the resurrection. Why? Because, well, they don't know what to do with the mind and the body, and so it's simply cleaner for us to be disembodied and to go to be with Jesus in some strange way, and that's the end of the story. And so now there's a theological problem, but it highlights the philosophical problem, which for me was so interesting in the last year or so, with a fuller understanding of Barfield and his look at, you know, obviously he has his schema, and then his role in terms of the inkling. I'm just currently going through a podcast on World War I, which is very helpful in terms of understanding Barfield and Tolkien and Lewis, all of whom were World War I veterans. And so, you know, these questions are difficult. And so I will ask people, what is matter for? What is the relationship between myself, which I think John really nailed this in a conversation he had with Benjamin Boyce, myself, which in many ways is sort of this narrative, which is non-disruptive disrupted as long as I'm healthy by my body. But then
Right.
once, things start breaking down, my equipment to create narrative, well, what is that narrative? Where is that narrative actually located? Why is it that my children in some ways know me better than I know myself? Why is it my wife? Why do you know John in some ways better than John knows himself? There's a world of mysterious questions here. And and someone would probably say the church is the last place I would ever go to deal with these things. And I think that, and I say, I hear that, and I know it, and I say, well, then the church has some deep, deep problems, because it seems to me these are probably some of the most important questions we can talk about.
Yeah, no, I agree, Paul. I think that's well said. I mean, the church should be the place that your instincts direct you to when you're contemplating these kinds of problems, because the church fills a function it's an inimitable function. There is no equivalent to it. Academe certainly isn't an equivalent to it, and arguably, to some degree, perhaps the emergence in the last century of the last couple of centuries, I suppose by now, psychotherapy is the caring for the soul that formerly the philosophic and religious enterprises had custody over, has tried to bridge a little bit of that difference. And I'm enough of a Jungian by disposition, I think, to appreciate that to some degree. But I mean, Jung himself would have said, well, it's insufficient. And it's insufficient. So we have nowhere else to turn. It's funny, one of the reasons why I was so kind of disaffected by my own religious identity when I was younger is that, and this is going to sound, I don't mean to start getting polemical with my past, the clergy that occupied the churches that I frequented as a kid. One of the reasons I was so disaffected by it is I was so unimpressed by them, which is a little harsh of me to say, but unfortunately it's true. I was so unimpressed. I don't mean that they need to be necessarily like virtuosic intellectuals. That's not what I mean either. I just mean like I scarcely heard a homily that was deeply insightful, either hermeneutically with reference to the actual text, to the actual scripture, or just writ large, or just in general. It happened on occasion, but it was so sparing that it just never happened. And the closest I ever came to that was a handful of choice professors, obviously, of which John is first and foremost, when I got to school. Not that they're in much abundance there either. Yeah. Let's harken back to Peterson for a second, because the reason I think, like, to me, Peterson's a fascinating figure to me, because to me, and I don't mean this pejoratively, Peterson is a preacher.
Yep.
He's a psychologist by training, and he's a lot of different things. What's the word I'm looking for? But fundamentally he's a preacher. And I think that the reason that he has attracted, one of the reasons that he's attracted so many people who have sort of unfulfilled religious inklings, or who are spiritually rapacious but have no object to sate them, is that he's assumed almost archetypally, he's assumed the role of a preacher, of a religious teacher. And that's not either a criticism or an aggrandizement of him, although I think that he has a clear, unambiguous gift for oratory. There's no disputing that, which is quite incredible. And he can speak extemporaneously, and he's very improvisational, right? In a way that, I mean, John is too. I mean, not that I need to start drawing comparisons between them, because people do that too often anyway. But I think that's part of what has magnetized so many people to him, is because he has the deportment and the temperament I think, and the style of a very well cultivated preacher. Yeah. And I think that's the role that he's assumed. No one wants to say that, because people who really who follow him, or people, students of his. I mean, students in the broad sense, right? The online, the people who go see his talks and that kind of thing. Students of his would probably be I don't mean it offensively at all, but I think a lot of people might eschew the idea of being caught up in that brushstroke of being attracted to someone because he was a preacher. But I think that's my take on it anyway. And so it speaks, so it speaks to what you're saying, that we crave that role. And we don't have it most of the time, because the people, many of, and there are exceptions. And I think and I'm not just trying to flatter you, Paul, one of the exceptions is who I'm speaking with right now, which makes it such a pleasure to speak to you, because you clearly are an exception to certainly what has been my experience with the church, is that it has not always provided, or very seldom provided, teachers that have fulfilled what I think their true function is or was.
Yeah. I think a lot of, we've got about 15 minutes yet, and I want to be a gracious host because I've dominated the conversation by pestering you with questions. So I want to give you a chance to ask what's on your list before we free up. I've got a debate after this.
You've got a debate?
Yeah, with Adam. Adam's debates aren't like debates with Sam Harris or anything, but the question we're debating is God real? So someone on Twitter said, Paul's gonna bind you in with those quotation marks, and it's probably true.
Is there an opportunity to reframe the question?
Well, that's what the whole conversation's going to be about.
I liked what you were saying. I liked what you and John were talking about in your last talk, about the fact that most debates about God, in fact, almost all of them, are preordained with a question that's usually not the appropriate question to begin with. And so it's like the game is rigged. I don't engage in most of these conversations about God. I default immediately. I default to abstinence when it comes to conversations about God, because I find that they're all preordained with an improper question. And obviously the discussion can only be as, a conversation can only be as productive or as fecund as the question that preceded it. And I always think, clearly God is, by some definition of real, God's real, because God has a prevailing presence in our grammar. We refer to God all the time. So clearly there is such a thing to which we refer, thing being the fraught term, right? And I say thing for lack of a better word, but clearly the expression God refers. Right. So to what does it refer? Let's start there. What is the nature of what God refers to, and I find that to be personally a much better place to start than does God exist? It's like, well, for goodness sakes.
I didn't say does God exist.
You said it real. No, anyway.
So there's two words but it's so ironic that, and so rather biblically prophetic that God has become a word that we cannot say.
Because we've devolved into such a regressive kind of literalism that it's like we're incapable of conceiving of such a thing without conceiving of it as like an object, like the glass of water on my table. It's like, well, clearly God is not an object. So, but the literalism has just infested all of the dialogue having to do with this topic. Yep. And that's why I find increasingly I have no patience for it, because if the conversation isn't framed properly and fitted with really kind of trustworthy and mature interlocutors, which I think is the most important thing of all, then I find often it's not worth having. Anyway, that's not a reflection on the debate you're about to have. You just
it'll be fun.
You just prompted a diatribe from me, because that's on my mind a lot.
Well, it's with Adam, and I trust Adam, so he wants to hook me up with some other guys that I don't necessarily trust. But to be a pastor is to go into go into places that perhaps angels fear to tread. That's part of our job. So anyway,
I like that. That's a good turn of phrase.
So okay, your questions. What do you want to, we got another 10 or 15 minutes. So.
Okay. Well, so I guess one of them is how, I mean, you've undertaken, as I say, courageously, and very, very industriously too, Paul. Like you're so prolific with your videos. Like I'd like to see them all, but I can't keep up.
Nobody can watch them all. That's part of my strategy.
So many.
I bury myself in hours of video. Any enemy that would want to get at me, they got a lot of work to do.
They do. Good strategy. Very tactical. But I guess how, if, and it's an if and then a how, if applicable, do you find that your relationship to your vocation and to your work, like your day-to-day pastoral work and your preaching, and I guess I'm particular, and I haven't seen your work in that respect yet, and I'd really like to. So I plan to do that. You have some videos dedicated to that, right?
I have a whole nother channel that is just my Sunday school and sermons. So I put that on a different channel, but the link to it is in the notes of my channel.
But it's there. Okay. So I apologize for not having explored that yet, but I intend to. So I guess my question is how, like all of those different branches that all feed into your pastoral vocation, how, or if and how has any of that changed as a result of these last months of dialogue that you've been having with all of these different discussants?
Oh, so my church, a little bit of context, my church is an aging, dying congregation, like a large percentage of small Protestant churches around the United States and Canada. And the church had its heyday during the Cold War and is not stylish or popular in all of the ways that churches can grow large by being stylish and popular. But that affords me a tremendous amount of freedom. And the church has always been very generous with my time and with my desire for continuing education. And so one of the things, I got into this because, again, I stumbled across Jordan Peterson and I watched his biblical series and I thought he's addressing in his own way a lot of what I believe the church needs to address, but has avoided it out of fear and a very foolish strategy towards self-preservation, which is usually conflict avoidance. And so all of this, what I've learned through the Peterson stuff and through John, all of this has been just deeply, it has fertilized my mind in terms, I should mention with gratitude Jonathan Peugeot as well, because his stuff has been really helpful in the symbolic world. I've lately been going through the Gospel of Mark, and my reading of the Gospel of Mark, I've read the Bible all my life, and so I'm very familiar with a lot of it. And I work in Greek and Hebrew to a degree and do traditional exegesis from, the history of biblical commentary and exegesis. But this new stuff has been so helpful in terms of understanding the text, understanding its importance, and trying to, preachers try to bridge two worlds. We have, especially in the Protestant tradition, we have the biblical account, which is foundational for us. And then, okay, how can it's expositional preaching. How can I expose the text to the people in a way that they can feed from it and be nourished from it deeply? And so all of this material for me has been so helpful in trying to not only expose the text to the 50 people who might be in attendance here at Little Living Stones, but also the 1,000 or some odd people who might watch my rough draft or my final cut of the sermon. My adult Sunday school class, which is 6 to 10, mostly elderly African-American women who sit there and tolerate my working through, right now we're in the Gospel of John, working through the Gospel of John painfully slowly. Lately, I've been doing a verse a week. But people who watch the video see that's all this stuff is just flooding into it. And so my local ministry and all of the stuff that I'm doing online kind of comes together in an estuary, which is, it's not fresh water, it's not salt water, but it's a fertile place where some of the fresh water and the saltwater creatures can mingle, and and that's what's happening.
And they're both slightly out of their element and slightly within their element.
Yes. And it's part of what keeps the church small, because when church strategy is almost always attract others who are solidly within your realm. But I'm much more of a missionary than a pastor. I've always been a missionary. My father was very much a missionary. And so to me, we kind of go out on the waters, and a lot of Christians will be like, he's not telling me all. A lot of Christian churches are, here are all the words, just keep repeating them. And that will keep us safely within our frame. And I'm not that way. And so that both attracts people and annoys people. And so if you read my comments, there's a lot of people who are attracted by it, but there's some people who come and they're pretty annoyed by it because I'm not saying all the things I'm supposed to say. And it's not like I don't know the words. Yeah, I know the words, but if I use those words, my conversation with you won't be terribly productive. And so I've found this all just life-giving, fruitful, fertilizing. And I think my people in my church, when I started making videos, they're like, oh, Paul's making videos. I'm not going to watch any YouTube, but his sermons have a little more life, so keep doing it. So I do.
So there's a cross-pollinating effect. There's a mutual influence between your embodied pastoral role in the physical space under the apsis of the church, but it also obviously feeds back into your videos. It also explains, like, I'm also curious just to hear more, and I guess apologies to your viewers if you've gone into this already in your videos, but I haven't heard it. Your missionary work, clearly the adventurousness in your personality isn't relegated to intellectual adventures, but also to physical adventures. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Like, where did you go? Where did you, what lands have you traversed?
Well, I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic.
Okay.
But the Christian Reform work in the Dominican Republic was primarily through Haitians who were in the country semi-legally, illegally, so on and so forth. So I was what was called a church developer, and my job was to mostly work with pastors, because the pastors and preachers worked with the people. The average educational level of the pastors and preachers I worked with was a second grade educational level in Haiti. I, in order to live in the Dominican Republic, learned Spanish, but the people primarily lived in Creole. So but some knew some Spanish. And so there was just a lot of movement there too. My father basically converted a old style bread and soup mission into a church in Paterson, New Jersey in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And spent 36 years there. So I grew up in a missionary context where we lived and worshiped in an African-American community with some Dutch Calvinists who were looking for something a little different from their churches, and a lot of African-Americans who were looking for something different from the Black churches. And so the church I grew up in was very much an estuary. But then the Christian Reformed Church has a long tradition of Christian day schools. So I went to school with all these Dutch Calvinists in New Jersey, but I lived and worshiped with the Black folks and the white folks who were interested in them. So right away, I was always in multi-layered cultural situations. And so the whitest place I ever lived was Calvin College.
You had a lot of variety, obviously.
Yeah. and I've always, so then I wound up after the mission field coming here to Sacramento, California, and I live in a neighborhood that got written up in Time magazine as the most diverse and integrated community in North America. I mean, there's no majority population here. And Sacramento has developed a culture which, while it's multicultural, isn't ghettoized, sort of like the New York metropolitan area was. You know, you had the Jewish section, you had the Italians, you had the Dutch, you had the blacks, you had the Puerto Ricans. So Sacramento's much more integrated. So I've always enjoyed multiple cultures together, which then with my more intellectual bent, it's like, okay, so we've got all these people speaking. Where does this mix? How do we meet? How do we connect? How do we understand each other? And my tiny little church here is just outrageously diverse. You've got millionaires, just a few, and tremendously educated people, and then you've got illiterate people, and Black folks and white folks and Asian folks and Hispanic folks, and now, you know, so then Jordan Peterson people started coming in, and I noticed the sermons are like, I don't know. I like the videos you do when you talk about Jordan Peterson. I can understand that, but I don't understand these other things. And it's like the gap between the church and the world is godlessly large. And especially for a religion that, as Northrop Frye mentioned in his lectures on the Old Testament, Christianity begins in translation, because the New Testament church works from the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. And so there's always been an element of always been an element of Christianity that is that you don't have to learn Arabic to read the Quran, or Hebrew to read the Torah. Christianity is always done in translation and has always been virally transcultural. And a big part of the problem, churches have to develop cultures to be cohesive communities, but that process insulates and isolates them from the rest of the culture. And so that's always the problem that the church has to work on. And it's also the case that heresy has almost always grown out of those interactions, but with heresy comes orthodoxy, because the church seldom discovers its orthodoxy until it struggles with heresy. And so there's a dynamic involved there that churches are, well, we're going to stay here and stay safe. So it's, and so for me, this has all been just fruitful and tremendously enjoyable.
Fantastic. Wow. That's, it's knowing that, having that context makes it all the more, I guess it's easy to see now how you have developed such a ready ease with being able to converse with a wide variety of people, because clearly that, perhaps the online context is new, but it's clearly that's something that you've been doing for a very long time and you're well practiced at it. And also at being able to adjust the levels of resolution of the dialogue itself to fit the interlocutor and to fit the audience. I sense that that's also something that you're able to do quite with a lot of dexterity, and it's clear that you're practiced at that with that kind of that's a storied history, Paul. That's great to know. That's fascinating.
Well, it's just my life. It's, you grow up and it's just what you know. But no, that's right. And my father had a gift for this too, though, and because he always had an intellectual, he had a library. He was reading C.S. Lewis and whatever would come across his path, but we'd spend time moving some lady's fridge or, feeding her dog, and so what's beautiful about pastoral work is that it very much scales. You need to engage the intellectual, but you also need to meet the illiterate person who just needs help writing out a check or reading a document.
Right.
And what you begin to discover is that, well, these are all image bearers of God, and the intellectual has their own blind sides, and before I started doing any of these videos, I started with the Freddie and Paul show on my channel, and I worried about how the flood of new people into my channel would interact with the Freddie and Paul show, because Freddie has his own story. But the day I am not in community with the Freddies of this world is the day that someone should pull my pastor card, because God lavishes his gifts in 10,000 places. And every time I go to lunch with Freddie, I learn something new from him. And so I am a student. I should be a student of everyone.
Mm-hmm. That's very well said. That's very well said. Yeah. Fantastic.
Well, maybe this is a good place to wrap up, because I think
that's a great final. I think that's a great final note. I'm happy to take that. Yeah, that's right. You've got this debate. Well, I don't know if it's appropriate to wish you luck. Is this the kind of? Hopefully, is this a Socratic kind of debate, where is this more of a dialogue, or is there a ring?
With Adam,
and
it'll
you're
be
both
you're both
duking it out.
No, with Adam, it'll be a very friendly dialogue, and that's part of the reason I agreed to do it with him. And he and I have spoken before. I think he likes to frame it as a debate, just so that we'll get some views. But it'll be I think it'll be a productive debate. So I can send this to you if you'd like to preview it. If you're willing to have me share it, I'll probably share it fairly soon.
You can go ahead and share it, Paul.
Okay.
I trust you.
All right. I will. Well, thank you so much, Chris. We will have to talk again.
I'd love to, Paul. I really enjoyed this. It was great fun, and thank you for the invitation. I really, really appreciate it. It's been such fun meeting you and chatting with you.
The feeling is mutual. So thank you, and say hi to John for me.
I shall. Okay. Absolutely.
Okay.
All right. Take care, Paul.
Yep. Bye-bye.